So today we're going to take it back to the 1920s. You heard right, folks, the era of jazz, flappers, and Henry Ford is just cranking out cars like nobody's business. When you think of Henry Ford, what comes to mind? The Model T car, maybe? Assembly lines, perhaps? Or the occasional inspirational, quirky quote? Quotes like, "Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. There's no disgrace in honest failure. There is disgrace in fearing to fail. If you have little money, women always ... Oh yeah, that's the stuff dreams are made of."
Are you sure about that?
Or maybe you think of him as the godfather of the 5-day, 40-hour work week. Or how he suddenly doubled the minimum wage of his workers to $5 a day. Now, before we celebrate all of the accomplishments of Henry Ford and all the great things he did, let's not get carried away just yet. Sure, Ford's pay bump raised some eyebrows and people benefited off of it, but it wasn't out of the generosity of his heart. That wasn't the reasoning behind it. Behind the scenes, old Henry, he had his reasons for the things that he did, and it was not for the betterment of the working class. Because beneath the shiny hood of his accomplishments lies a tangled web of controversies and questionable decisions that we're going to unpack today. Let's dive into the controversial life of Henry Ford. Henry Ford actually came from relatively humble beginnings. He was born on July 30th in 1863 in Wayne County, Michigan, on his family's farm. And he was one of 8 children born to immigrant parents, William and Mary Ford. And having halted his education at the 8th grade, his father thought that he would take over the family farm. This is really what he wanted. But Henry, he had other plans. This was the last thing that he wanted to do with his life. So at 16 years old, he left home to find work in Detroit, and he became an apprentice machinist and worked for a couple of companies. But after a few years of that, he returned to the family farm and he worked part-time for the Westinghouse Engine Company, which was a manufacturer of steam and gas engines. And on the side, he would tinker around in this little machine shop that he built on his family's farm. And then some years later, he moved back to Detroit and he decided to settle down. He got married, had a kid, and it was during this time he became the chief engineer at the main Detroit Edison Company plant, where he was responsible for ensuring the city received electricity 24/7. And it was also during this time as well that Ford would spend his off hours just tinkering around and experimenting. And while tinkering at this time, he had his sights set on creating a gas-powered automobile. And by 1893, at 30 years old, he did just that. And what he would do is Ford would continuously sell his creations, and then from those profits, he would then improve upon his creations. And then it was like this continuous cycle where he was always funding his projects with the last project. And this took place over a 7-year period. He would have various investors who would eventually abandon him because he insisted on continuously improving the product instead of just putting it out there on the market. And it was because of this that he got on a lot of people's nerves, especially among Detroit's wealthy elite. I mean, these people were getting really tired of giving him their money and not getting a profit out of it, because again, this is like a 7-year period, makes sense. But then in 1903, Ford was finally ready to put his product on the market. Ford, along with a group of investors and the support from the Dodge brothers, founded the Ford Motor Company. And they raised a total of $28,000 in capital, $21,000 of which was from Henry's own pockets. And the remaining amount of that money came from investors, family members, friends, just everywhere. The company began production and they released the Model A, but it was the introduction of the Model T in 1908 that marked a turning point for Ford Motor Company. And the Model T became super popular, and Ford was able to produce a ton of these vehicles. And that is because he revolutionized manufacturing with the introduction of the assembly line in 1913. And on top of that, they also implemented a really aggressive marketing campaign. I mean, you can still find tons of advertisements related to the Model T car in archives today. I came across a ton of them in my research. In addition to Ford's approach to manufacturing, as well as this aggressive marketing campaign, the Model T was also more affordable to a lot of people, and they also introduced financing. So consumers had the option to pay off the vehicle with a monthly payment. And so Ford's innovative approach to mass production of affordable transportation, it left a lasting impact on the global manufacturing landscape. And the success of Ford Motor Company made Henry Ford an iconic figure in history. And now that's all fine and dandy, okay? Wonderful. But Ford as a human being, not the best guy. And oh boy, where do we start? Let's start with the Dearborn Independent. From 1920 to 1927, Ford had a newspaper that was called the Dearborn Independent. And this newspaper was distributed to Ford dealers, schools, and libraries all over the country. Now, keep that in the back of your head, okay? Schools, libraries, dealerships, all over the country. And it was completely free of charge. So Ford was pretty determined to get these news articles out there to the public. This newspaper, which was local to Dearborn, Michigan, was purchased by Ford in 1919. And you may be asking yourself, why would a car tycoon, or whatever you want to call him, want to purchase a newspaper company? So he could share his batshit ideologies in a public platform without anyone hindering him. That is why, and I am not over-exaggerating. Let me explain. Ford would share his opinions in this newspaper on a variety of topics related to social stuff, political, economic. These were all just his opinions. Among those topics were very anti-Semitic views. He published 90 anti-Semitic articles throughout the lifespan of the newspaper under his ownership. You can't say he wasn't passionate about his hate. He was that. These 90 articles were later collected and distributed as a book called The International Jew. In these articles, Ford expresses some horrific views about the Jewish community, including conspiracy theories and just downright discriminatory ideologies. I was able to find a digitized copy of The International Jew, and I read a couple of pages as part of the research for this video. It's like over 400 pages. So no, there's no way I was going to even read a quarter of that bullshit. But after learning about it, I did want to see it for myself. Like, does this really exist? Yes, it really exists. And it is really nuts. Okay, this man was nuts. Over 400 pages of this. You can't be all there.
We have a problem. We have a problem. Ladies and gentlemen, we have problems.
And to show you exactly what I mean, I'm going to read some of the titles of these articles to you because I feel like the titles alone provide enough of an idea, paints a pretty good picture of what this guy was about without providing any context of what it's actually saying. Like, the titles serve the purpose. All right, so there's The Jew in Character and Business, An Introduction to Jewish Protocols, The Scope of Jewish Dictatorship in the United States, and How the Jews Use Power, an eyewitness. He had an eyewitness account of how the Jewish community uses its power. Honestly, this kind of is giving me PTSD a little bit with the Malleus Maleficarum. I did a video on that book, which is an old book called The Witch's Hammer that was used to identify and persecute witches. And some of the stuff that the author would write was just bonkers, and it included things like witches make men's penises just vanish and they eat corn and oats, and here's an eyewitness account of it. So I'm just kind of providing a parallel example here. I'm looking at those side by side. They're both pretty crazy, okay? They're sharing too many similarities. Ford even went as far as to include the actual names of Jewish Americans and Jewish organizations, and tying them into these conspiracies that he claimed that they were a part of. And these same organizations were a bit hesitant to take legal action against Ford and the newspaper. And I think that alone really speaks volumes as to the type of man Henry Ford was, as well as the type of power that he had. It wasn't until a Jewish lawyer named Aaron Shapiro stepped to the plate, and with no support, might I add, that Ford would be sued for defamation in 1925. And this whole trial became such a farce, not on Shapiro's end, on Ford's end. Ford's lawyers, with the assistance of a U.S. senator, delayed the trial for 2 whole years, and Ford hid from a subpoena for 16 months. And the whole thing played out in the media. It was a media circus. And also, might I add, during the trial, the court didn't even want to discuss anti-Semitism, which is crazy because that is literally the crux of the libel that was going on in the newspaper. The trial would eventually end in a mistrial, and Ford would go on to release a public letter of apology for his anti-Semitic views.
You're killing me. Next caller.
Now, speaking of Ford's anti-Semitic views, fun fact, Hitler was a huge fan of Henry Ford. Honestly, at this point, that comes as no surprise. Hitler read a lot of these anti-Semitic diatribes that Ford wrote for the Dearborn. He even gave Ford a shout out in Mein Kampf as the single great man of the American Union standing up against the Jews. Also, Ford was the first American to be gifted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. And if you don't know what that is, this was a high-ranking German decoration awarded during the Nazi era, and it was typically given to foreigners who were deemed to have made significant contributions to the Nazi regime or had expressed their support for their ideologies. And Ford was the first to receive this honor. And Ford's fascist ideologies did not end at the Dearborn Independent. Oh, no. They also influenced his management style as a businessman. And he's been described as taking on a more autocratic approach or authoritarian approach to business, the way he treated his employees, everything.
I've made a decision. I'm captain of this boat. Now shut the fuck up!
And I thought it would be helpful to give some examples of some of the characteristics of somebody who's more of an authoritarian or autocratic leader, just because I think it gives kind of a better idea of what Henry Ford was like as a businessman, as an employer, as an overall human being. An autocratic leader typically prefers highly structured environments. They make most, if not all, decisions and takes into consideration limited to no input from stakeholders. They're often resistant to change, and rules are greatly stressed upon, often finite, and creativity and problem-solving solutions from others is not valued. Sounds like a really fulfilling workplace for employees. Now, some well-known autocratic leaders are Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Kim Jong-un, and Elon Musk. Now, I'm not saying that all these people share the same ideologies or approaches. I'm just that these people are partial to this approach to leadership and management. I'm not trying to say that Bill Gates equals Adolf Hitler. We're not doing that, okay? I'm just saying that a lot of these people share very similar characteristics across the board when it comes to the way they approach leadership. One of the many cons in this leadership style in business is a very high turnover rate amongst employees. And this is something that Henry Ford faced. Henry Ford is known as being the godfather of the 5-day, 40-hour work week, as well as implementing a minimum wage, which wasn't a thing back then. The U.S. Fair Labor Standards Act, which implemented the first federally mandated minimum wage, would not be passed until 1938. So this was pretty, advanced for its time. This was a big deal. And it most certainly inspired our federally mandated minimum wage that we have in the U.S. today. So Ford did introduce these great changes that were seemingly for the betterment of the working class. However, much of these changes were due out of necessity as well as for profit. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So let's start with the assembly line. Ford installed the first moving assembly line in 1913 to mass produce automobiles in his factories. Now, before the assembly line, it would take about 12 hours to produce one car, just one. After the implementation of the assembly line, it went from 12 hours to an hour and 33 minutes on average. That is crazy. So as you can imagine, he was able to produce a massive amount of vehicles, and this equated to big time profit. And just to paint an even clearer picture, Ford could produce 1,000 cars a day with this approach to manufacturing. And I mean, today, maybe that's not a big thing. I'm not, knowledgeable on car manufacturing in the 21st century, but either way, like 1,000 cars a day in this time period is amazing. And at this time, a Ford vehicle cost anywhere from $360 to maybe $700, depending on the body type of the vehicle. And give or take, the price kind of fluctuated throughout the year. So somewhere in that ballpark. So 1,000 cars a day, $300 something to $700 each. You do the math. That was a lot of money. Now, if you were an employee on this assembly line, you would perform one task over and over again. If it was your job to create the dashboard, that was your job. You created dashboards 5 days a week, 40 hours a week. And it didn't matter what your skill level was. And so many of the skilled workers in the Ford factories found this type of work super monotonous and exhausting. And as a result, turnover was high amongst employees. And not to mention, the working conditions were ass. They sucked. I actually read a letter that was written by one of the workers' wives to Ford expressing her frustration with the working conditions that her husband had to deal with. And she was essentially demanding Ford to do something about it. That is how bad the working conditions were for these men. And so managers would hire 10 employees for every one to try to make up for this really high turnover. But this was really just putting a band-aid on a really huge problem. So to remedy this issue, Ford rolled out the $5 a day minimum wage, as well as cutting back their hours by introducing the 5-day 40-hour work week. The morning after the announcement of these changes, 10,000 men showed up at the Ford factories looking for work, many of which were immigrants. So Ford's decision to increase wages and decrease working hours was not out of the kindness of his heart. It was to keep workers in his factories who were leaving due to shit working conditions, in addition to enticing the workers to purchase a Ford vehicle. And I mean, when you think about it from a capitalistic, business perspective, it's kind of genius. It's really smart. He created an entire consumer class based off of these changes. You have these workers who are building these vehicles day in, day out, and you give them enough money to now be able to afford to buy them, the thing that they're around all the time. And don't forget, we got financing as an option. But by the 1930s, workers began to unionize for better wages, and Ford did not like this one bit. He was not having it. His response was so brutal. He decided to entrust this affair in the hands of a man named Harry Bennett, one of his key executives. And let's just say Harry Bennett had this reputation of being not the nicest guy. And so what resulted in the end was violence and bloodshed. And this includes what is now known as the Battle of the Overpass, which took place on May 26, 1937. Labor organizers, including members of the United Auto Workers Union, clashed with Ford-hired security on the overpass leading to the Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan. And if you ask me, these dudes look like straight up mafia, okay? Like when you look at this picture, you can really tell who's the hired muscle and who the labor organizers are. I feel like it's pretty clear. Look at how friendly the labor organizers are. Like when I look at this picture, all I can think is like, oh, these poor men. They look all like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. They're all like, yeah, unions, woohoo, passing out leaflets to the workers. And then here come these, robust gentlemen ready to crack some skulls. Like you could tell how they were coming. But then you got the one labor organizer who it looks like he knows what's about to happen. He's sitting there like, oh, I'd have been through this. I'd have seen some shit as a labor organizer. This is about to get real. But all jokes aside, this was a very serious event. And get this, after this horrific event took place, Ford Motor Company tried their damnedest to destroy all photographic evidence of this event taking place. Obviously, they failed. And you know what? The United Auto Workers Union would get the last laugh because they would eventually win the rights to organize Ford Motor Company workers, and the first contract was signed in 1941. Henry Ford considered the unionization of the Ford Motor Company his greatest disappointment. I feel like that speaks volumes about him as a person. This is by no means the full extent of all the messed up stuff and controversies surrounding Henry Ford's life. This guy was just straight up just not a nice person, not a good guy. One could write an entire dissertation of the mistreatment of his employees alone. I didn't even cover how he had a knack for controlling every aspect of his employees' lives. During my research, I came across a lot of disturbing stuff in relation to this, how Ford would attempt to control his employees' lives, not like just at work, but also at home, in the homes they paid bills for. He expected his employees to be part of what is known as a nuclear family. Anything outside of that was considered to be unconventional in Ford's eyes, he frowned upon. And of course, this is your boss, so this affects you as a worker. He even created a program where there were Ford inspectors who would come to your home as an employee, and they would inspect it to make sure that you were living in a manner that aligned with Ford's ideals. Amongst these ideals was what he considered to be virtuous living. And this included abstaining from alcohol, not visiting speakeasies, whatever he felt was virtuous. I wish a boss would. See, we need to do a video on the history of HR because Ford Motor Company was in desperate need of an HR department. Another batshit thing that he did was he would discourage employees from speaking any language outside of English. And remember, there were a lot of employees at the Ford Motor Company who recently immigrated to the United States from all over the world. And to entice the employees to follow these batshit ideals that he had, he created an employee loyalty program where he rewarded employees who he felt were following these expectations outside of the workplace. So yeah, Henry Ford, not a great guy. Anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.